The Locomotive Exchange of 1925 is one of the most famous episodes in railway history. It features two of the world's most iconic locomotives, Flying Scotsman and Pendennis Castle. But how well do you really know this story? It's time to re-examine this legendary railway contest and separate the myths from the facts. The story of the Locomotive Exchange has been told many times, and it usually goes something like this. In 1924, each of Britain's leading railway companies was invited to send a locomotive for display at the prestigious British Empire Exhibition in Wembley. The London and North Eastern Railway, or LNER, chose one of their new A1 class locomotives, number 4472, Flying Scotsman. The Great Western Railway sent one of their new Castle class engines, number 4073, Caerphilly Castle. The two locos were displayed side by side, but the Great Western proudly placed a sign on Caerphilly Castle claiming that it was the most powerful express engine in Britain. Now, on paper at least, this was absolutely true. The Castles had a higher tractive effort than the A1s, mostly because they operated at a higher boiler pressure. The Castles had their boilers pressed to 225 pounds per square inch, whereas the A1s operated at a boiler pressure of only 180 pounds per square inch. But tractive effort is a largely theoretical figure, which doesn't always reflect an engine's true capabilities under real-life operating conditions. At any rate, Flying Scotsman was bigger and heavier than the Castle, and the LNER took exception to the Great Western's claim. Rather foolishly, they threw down the gauntlet and challenged the Great Western to a locomotive exchange. At the end of April 1925, the LNER duly sent an A1 locomotive to the Great Western Railway, whilst the Great Western sent another Castle, number 4079 Pendennis Castle, to King's Cross. The result was a total humiliation for the LNER. The Castle gave a dazzling performance on the East Coast Main Line, achieving better times than the A1s whilst consuming far less coal. The A1 meanwhile gave a mediocre performance on the Great Western route to Plymouth. To make matters even worse for the LNER, the Wembley exhibition reopened for a second season on the 9th of May, and the Great Western decided to hammer home their victory by sending Pendennis Castle for display alongside Flying Scotsman. Flying Scotsman went on to have an extraordinary life. She's broken records, travelled the world, and appeared on the silver screen. But, thanks to the 1925 Locomotive Exchange, Pendennis Castle has always been remembered as the engine that humbled the mighty Flying Scotsman. It certainly makes a good story, and parts of it are certainly true. But is it really fair to say that the Great Western won a thumping victory over the LNER? And were the trials even supposed to be a competition in the first place? Let's start by clearing up the most obvious misconception that the trials were a head-to-head duel between Flying Scotsman and Pendennis Castle. In fact, there were 5 locomotives involved in the exchange trials, and Flying Scotsman was not one of them. Why so many engines? Well, that was because of the format of the trials. The official trial runs took place over 6 days, from Monday the 27th of April to Saturday the 2nd of May. However, the visiting engines were also given some preliminary runs to allow the crews to familiarise themselves with the routes. Throughout the trials, the visiting engines were operated by crews from their own company, with a local driver to act as pilotman. Now, for the purposes of the trials, each company selected 2 diagrams, which the visiting engines would work on alternate days. So, on Monday, Wednesday and Friday, Pendennis Castle operated the 10:10 am train from King's Cross to Grantham, returning at 3:07 pm. Meanwhile, over on the Great Western, the A1 was operating the 10:30 am departure from Paddington to Plymouth in one direction only, because you see the distance from Paddington to Plymouth is roughly double that from King's Cross to Grantham. Then on the Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday, Pendennis Castle worked a slightly longer journey, the 1:30 pm from King's Cross to Doncaster, returning at 6:21 pm. Meanwhile, the A1 was working its return journeys from Plymouth to Paddington, departing at 12:30 pm. For comparative purposes, each company also recorded one of its own locomotives working the same diagrams on the alternate days during the trial period. So, in other words, on the East Coast Main Line, an A1 worked the Grantham trains on Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday, and the Doncaster trains on Monday, Wednesday and Friday, whilst on the Great Western, a Castle worked from Paddington to Plymouth on Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday, and from Plymouth to Paddington on Monday, Wednesday and Friday. Because the trial runs on both the Great Western and the East Coast main lines took place over the same week, that meant that 2 pairs of engines had to be used. The LNER chose A1 class number 4474 as its ambassador to the Great Western, and it was pitted against Castle class number 4074, Caldecott Castle. I should point out that number 4474 was not named at this time, although she was later known as Victor Wilde. As is well known, number 4079 Pendennis Castle was sent by the Great Western to the LNER, and she was supposed to be competing against A1 class number 4475 Flying Fox. However, the latter failed during the first day of the trials due to a hot axle box, and she was replaced for the rest of the week by sister engine number 2545. Again, the latter was running without a name at this time, although she later became Diamond Jubilee. Neither company made any public statement about why these particular engines were chosen, but it's reasonable to assume that they were thought to be in good condition and had a reputation for being good performers. But, as will become apparent, the Great Western perhaps made better choices in this respect than the LNER. The second myth to bust is that the LNER threw down the gauntlet and were then embarrassed when the trials didn't go their way. In fact, it was not the LNER who suggested a competitive trial. It's true that the trials were initiated by Nigel Gresley, the LNER's chief mechanical engineer, and the man who designed the A1s. But recent research by Simon Martin has revealed that Gresley's original request to the Great Western was purely to borrow a Castle class for trial runs on the East Coast Main Line. It was Sir Felix Pole, the general manager of the Great Western, who responded to Gresley by suggesting the idea of a two-way locomotive exchange. So much for the background, but what about the results of the trials? The Great Western essentially claimed victory on 2 grounds. Firstly, that the Castles consumed less coal than the A1s, and secondly, that they managed to achieve better timings during the trial runs. Let's look at the coal consumption first. Well, it's perfectly true that the Castles did achieve better coal consumption during the trials. On the Great Western route, Caldecott Castle's average coal consumption was 12% lower than that of number 4474. And on the East Coast Main Line, Pendennis Castle's average coal consumption was 6% lower than that of number 2545. But if you think that this result was a massive humiliation for Nigel Gresley, well, maybe not. In fact, the greater fuel economy of the castles probably didn't surprise him at all. Why? Because in July 1924, Charles Collett, Gresley's counterpart on the Great Western, had given a paper to the World Power Conference in London, in which he discussed the fuel consumption of the castles, the engines which, of course, he had designed. He claimed that, under test, one castle had achieved fuel consumption of just 2.83 pounds per drawbar horsepower hour. Now, this was well in advance of anything being achieved by any contemporary British express locomotive. By contrast, when Flying Scotsman ran trials on the LNER in 1923, her average coal consumption was measured at about 4 pounds per drawbar horsepower hour. Now, this was clearly greater than the figure that Collett was claiming for the castles, but it was nevertheless better than some contemporary designs, particularly the Hughes 460s on the LMS, which were consuming about 5 pounds per drawbar horsepower hour. Collett's claims about the castles may have raised some eyebrows, but the basic reasons why they were so economical were understood by contemporary commentators, such as the Railway Magazine's locomotive performance expert, Cecil J. Allen. The most important factors were, firstly, that the castles worked at a higher boiler pressure, and secondly, that they used long travel valves, which reduced the back pressure in the cylinders and allowed the steam to be used more expansively. With all of this in mind, the results of the trials probably came as no surprise to Gresley. In fact, Gresley pretty much admitted this in a memorandum which he wrote to the LNER Locomotive Committee after the trials. He said that, and I quote, "I anticipated that on Welsh coal, the Great Western engine would probably be more economical, but I expected that with Yorkshire coal, the LNE engine would give better results. Conclusive results, however, cannot be obtained from such a short trial, and so far as burning Yorkshire coal is concerned, I am confident that if the trial had been extended, the position would have been reversed." Unquote. Well, that last sentence might be a little bit of bravado on Gresley's part, but it's certainly true that there are many factors which can affect an engine's coal consumption on a day-to-day basis, and the 6 runs undertaken during the official trials represent a fairly small sample of data. Indeed, it's quite notable that during number 4474's runs on the Great Western, her coal consumption consistently declined during the course of the trials, from 50.9 pounds per mile on her first trip to Plymouth to just 40.4 pounds on the final trip. This may partly reflect the engine's crew becoming more familiar with the route over the course of the trial. But when we calculate the average coal consumption for the eastbound runs over the entire course of the trial, the figures for Caldecott Castle and number 4474 are exactly the same, 45.5 pounds per mile. In any case, coal consumption is not the only cost that has to be considered when operating a locomotive. In his memo to the Locomotive Committee, Gresley defended his choice of a lower pressure boiler on the A1s by arguing that a higher boiler pressure would lead to increased maintenance costs. Allen also defended this view in the Railway Magazine, arguing that, and I quote, "It would need some years of trials such as these, with a very close watch on all maintenance expenditure, to ascertain whether the cost of reduced coal consumption more than balances the increased cost of maintenance." Unquote. Nevertheless, Gresley must have changed his views about boiler pressures and long travel valves. After the locomotive exchange, all the A1s were modified with longer travel valves. In fact, Oswald Nock claims that Gresley's team had already begun to develop the valve gear modifications before the exchange trials began. Either way, Gresley certainly followed this up by increasing the boiler pressure of the A1s to 220 pounds from 1927 onwards. With this modification, the A1s were reclassified as A3. All the A1s were eventually converted to the A3 specification, although this process was not completed until 1949. Returning to the 1925 trials, it's also worth noting that Gresley and Collett originally agreed that neither side would publish the official data from the trials except by mutual consent. Unfortunately, this agreement broke down because Cecil J. Allen gave a radio interview about the trials. Now, as well as being a magazine columnist, Allen was also an LNER employee, and the Great Western considered his account of the trials to be biased. They therefore responded by publishing a rather selective account of the trials, including data on coal consumption, in the Great Western magazine. But nevertheless, the fact that Gresley and Collett had made their agreement in the first place strongly suggests that both men genuinely wanted to use the data for scientific purposes, rather than to try to publicly demonstrate the superiority of their own locomotive design. So, what can we take away from all this? Well, in the long run, Collett was certainly vindicated in his use of high boiler pressures and long travel valves. But all the same, the results of the 1925 locomotive exchange weren't such a clear-cut victory for the Great Western as many people think. And even if the castles did have the edge in terms of fuel economy, it's unlikely that Gresley lost any sleep over it. But there's still one last question we need to answer. Which locomotives achieved the better speeds and timings? Well, to answer that question, we're going to need to crunch a lot more numbers, so I'm going to save that for part 2 of this video. In the meantime, if you found this interesting, please remember to like and subscribe, and I hope to see you for part 2 of my Locomotive Exchange Mythbuster. Thank you for watching.